And so, my friends, this tale of Shadow's embrace, of Taylor and her secrets in darkness space, lingers like a whisper, a shiver down your spine, a reminder that darkness in all of us may intertwine. A quote from a poem by Taylor Schabusiness, also known as Lady Dahmer, the man-eating, murdering, meth-smoking mistress of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be discussing the tragic case of Shad Thyrion losing his life to Taylor Schabusiness, also known as Taylor Coronado, both of Green Bay, Wisconsin. So just to give you a heads up, there will be a lot of talk about a lot of very gory, dark things in today's episode, so listener discretion is advised. There will be two relevant topics to Taylor Coronado's case I will be discussing today. One will include methamphetamine addiction. And for those of you who are not familiar with the substance methamphetamine, for all intents and purposes, I would like you to consider it the devil's crystal, and be forewarned that those who imbibe in the devil's crystal are foretold not to return to their sanity afterwards. And then we will also be discussing the role that post-partum psychosis possibly had in Taylor Coronado's destructive, sadistic, twisted actions on February 23rd of 2022, where she took Shad Thyrion's life and dismembered him. And then afterwards, she placed his decapitated head in a plastic bucket, covered it up with a towel, and left it in Shad's mother's basement for his mother and stepfather to find the next day. So let's say that one day you meet the devil and he makes you an offer that you can't refuse. And yeah, you know it's too good to be true, but come on. Life's been real rough lately and you could use a little treat. So you take the devil up on his offer and soon he makes an ass of you, like he usually does. But this time you signed your soul over to the devil, because he's had you on his mind for a long time. Because you like to flirt with the devil, and you've liked to flirt with the devil for a while now. And the temptation hasn't always been your fault, because at one point you were innocent. But over time, things took a dark turn for you. And soon you found yourself not only in cahoots with the devil, but you dethroned him altogether. And you, yourself, became the devil. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just one trajectory of those who tempt the devil by imbibing in his crystal. So, just to make a very heavy disclaimer here, I am not equating addiction with anything to do with Satanism, devil worship, any of the like, evil, any of the like. What I am trying to illustrate is that an addiction to such a high-powered chemical like methamphetamine can make good people do bad things, and it could make bad people do terrible things. Someone like Taylor Coronado, who exhibits very much a psychopathic personality, combined with high-powered stimulant use, is going to be a factor that plays into these heinous acts. And we see this in many serial killers. Look at Jeffrey Dahmer and his alcohol abuse. Look at Ted Bundy and his alcohol abuse that played a role in his crimes. Look at Richard Ramirez, allegedly used cocaine prior to his killings as well. So we have to look at the nature of high-powered chemicals like methamphetamine, cocaine, even alcohol, and how these things play in criminal behavior. Because drugs do not cause criminal behavior, but they certainly do exacerbate pre-existing dark triad evil traits. So we all need to do our part to end the stigma of addiction, because addiction is an illness. It is a disease, and it deserves and merits treatment just like any medical disease. However, the caveat being, when we're looking at the criminal world, and we're looking at how drugs play into modification of behavior, research into this field is worth its weight in gold because it will prevent tragedies like this from happening in the future. And that is why when Judge Tom Walsh sentenced Taylor Coronado, he made mention of the lack of investment in communities in trying to solve the methamphetamine epidemic. Because it may not affect you, but it certainly affects someone you know, whether you're conscious of it or not right now. And we can debate how we can solve the crisis, but ultimately, cases like this only highlight the deep, deep, dark, seedy crevices of things that can happen as a result of a high-power substance being in the wrong hands. But the large majority of people that are affected by methamphetamine addiction do not and are not evil, twisted, warped creatures like this young woman. The majority of people who are affected by methamphetamine addiction is your son or daughter, your friend, your spouse, your coworker, people you grew up with, people you went to high school with, people that you would never think would be addicted, people who were valedictorians of their high school class. Nobody is immune to addiction. And I'm saying this as someone who has spoken with many people who struggle with addiction or have struggled in the past with addiction, including to methamphetamine. The other thing with methamphetamine is it is a very, very dangerous combination for someone who has pre-existing psychosis or bipolar disorder. So for these individuals who have a family history or themselves are diagnosed with something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or something to do with psychosis that makes them susceptible to losing touch with reality, a high-powered stimulant is going to be the last thing that that person needs. Absolutely not. And so while sometimes we see these disorders overlap with things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which can be treated with something like a low-dose amphetamine, low dose in comparison to methamphetamine. Again, when we're talking about free range of high-powered chemicals, methamphetamine itself was only ever prescribed to treat severe cases of ADHD, and that is far and long gone because we have much better medications out there, even non-stimulant medications that can effectively treat ADHD. We're out of the Ritalin era, although for some people methylphenidate is effective to treat their legitimate mental health condition. So, again, I could do a whole video to break down amphetamines, legal or otherwise, and I would be happy to do that if people were interested in that. But let's just summarize this first half of the video with understanding that we all right now need to get on the same page. End the stigma of addiction. Do not treat it as a moral flaw, because that is not what we're talking about here. The reason that I'm talking about methamphetamine addiction here is because of the potential for it to be dangerous in many, many circumstances. And again, Miss Coronado's case only highlights how a powerful addiction like this can exacerbate an extreme manifestation of an extremely dangerous, evil set of behavior traits. Look up the dark triad, the dark tetrad, psychopaths, and in this case, we have an incredibly dangerous female psychopath. She is incredibly rare, and it seems like she relishes in that fact, and so we really should not give her that kind of satisfaction to relish in this, but yes, a slaying like this from a young female is incredibly rare, and that's why we need to study her and understand all of the different aspects that went into a horrible, awful slaying like this, because as much as headlines like the ones of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein shock us nationwide for decades and decades, people around Wisconsin talk about these cases. People around the world still talk about these cases because they are so horrific and they grasp us with just how terrible they are. And if we are just going to read these headlines and shock and awe and move past it and not really study these people to the best extent that we can to understand how high-powered substances have an impact on evil acts like this. Just as, even if that's the only reason that we look at ending methamphetamine addiction, is just to make sure that people like Taylor do not do these types of things. If that's the only reason that we end methamphetamine addiction in this country and worldwide, that would be fine. Even though the primary reason we need to be looking at ending methamphetamine addiction is because addiction is a worldwide epidemic. It affects every single family, good, bad, or mediocre. It doesn't matter who you are. Nobody is immune. The second subject of today's video is going to be postpartum psychosis. And again, I'm going to lay on a thick disclaimer here that women who do experience postpartum psychosis or postpartum mental illness do not have a moral character flaw, are not experiencing a moment of weakness. They are experiencing an earth-shattering mental health crisis. Because again, birth is a life-altering traumatic experience for not only someone's body, but a woman's total hormonal balance. And if you understand women's mental health, you understand the important precarious balance that hormones play in a woman's mental health. And before, during, and after a woman gives birth, she goes through an extreme fluctuation of hormone changes. And if she has a pre-existing mental health condition, that is going to be exacerbated. And so this is information that her OBGYN, her doctor, her family, her doula, whoever needs to be aware of. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't know. And because sometimes a woman may have absolutely no history of any kind of mental health condition up until she gives birth to her first child and experiences postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, maybe even postpartum obsessive compulsive disorder, which is possible. And in extreme circumstances, some women will experience postpartum psychosis. And again, psychosis being a break with reality, which is incredibly dangerous for the individual and possibly the people around them as well. And again, psychosis is not a moral character flaw. Psychosis is not a momentary lapse of weakness. Psychosis is a serious loss of touch with what is right and wrong and what is real, right? So, well, maybe sometimes somebody is experiencing a brief psychotic episode. Some people, a psychotic episode might be continue because it's not received the proper intervention. And that is, again, where people are at risk for being at danger of themselves or another person. And we might see them at risk for whether that's self-harm or ideation or thoughts about hurting somebody else, right? And this can happen in perfectly healthy people that have no dark triad traits, and all of a sudden the voices, the demonic presence, whatever it is from the psychosis is telling them to do something, and it's just an overwhelming compulsion to do that thing. They cannot say no because, again, they are not in their right frame of mind. So we see this again when we look at the infamous case of Andrea Yates from the early 90s. It's almost 30 years ago. And we still have so much to learn about maternal mental well-being and the role that postpartum psychosis can play in women when they are not carefully monitored by their care team. And even in the case of Miss Andrea Yates, who seemed to have excellent access to care, was still failed by the system in terms of properly medicating her for her bipolar and psychosis. And I'm not going to go into all the details of how the system failed Andrea Yates. There is a lot of great YouTube content out there. I recently listened to the True Crime Brewery podcast episode that they did on Andrea Yates to just refresh myself a little bit on the timeline and some of the factors that went into Andrea Yates. In addition, other content creators that have covered Andrea Yates more recently include Emma Kenny. She also does true crime content as well from a pretty compassionate perspective. One main thing, again, I'm going to point out is the role that substances have on psychosis and bipolar, on people with predispositions for these types of disorders. So we can talk about a high power chemical street drug like methamphetamine, crystal meth, uh, whatever you want to call it. And we can also talk about pharmaceuticals, which, although are regulated and are rigorously tested through evidence based methods and things like that, they still do have side effects and they still do have unintended consequences for vulnerable people. So, again, looking at bipolar disorder, one of the primary things that a psychiatrist will know, hopefully in their first year of med school, is that you do not give somebody with bipolar disorder an SSRI, typical antidepressant medication, as the first line of treatment for bipolar disorder, because you will put them into mania, and we don't want that. So again, you don't give them Zoloft, you don't give them Celexa. You're going for Lamictal, lamotrigine, mood stabilizer in that kind of family, right? That's probably going to be your first go-to, possibly the antipsychotics as well. However, as a primary mode of treatment, the psychiatrist that treated Miss Yates was trying to give her antidepressants when she had a history of psychosis and possibly was diagnosed with bipolar. So I'll give him a little bit of leeway since that was the 90s and we know better now. But in the case of Taylor Coronado, again, Andrea Yates was an angelic sweetheart, a loving mother of 5 who dedicated her entire existence to her babies. And we can't say the same of Miss Coronado because she chose methamphetamine over her baby. And most of us abhor people like that, understandably. But she is also a victim of postpartum psychosis. Taylor Coronado gave birth to her son Mateo on October 2021. And the following February is when she committed the awful, heinous atrocity against Shad Thyrion. And in that time, very quickly after she had given birth to Mateo, allegedly the baby was given to her grandparents, and with the intention that they were going to adopt the child. And there was reports from her husband Warren Schabusiness that Taylor did experience postpartum psychosis, postpartum depression, and she was hospitalized, I believe, for a suicide attempt during that time as well, around the time of the birth of Mateo. So this was a very, very sick woman who was not medicated, was not consenting to treatment the way that she needed to. Her family was not invested in getting her the proper resources and her husband was clearly more invested in allowing her to continue to abuse methamphetamine while he went off and did whatever and is now in prison for something unrelated. Probably meth. So again, this is a very sick couple, probably a very toxic combination. In addition to these dark triad traits, which we don't even have to go into what happens with that kind of Bonnie and Clyde duo. So in addition to having pretty much no support from her family and continue to being able to use this high-powered substance, this woman with extreme mental illness and trauma and dark triad features was just allowed to become this extreme monster. And again, she is culpable for these incredible, heinous acts that she committed. But she is an actively psychotic individual, at least at the time that she was evaluated by Diane Litton, and at least at the time she was evaluated by professionals when she was actively psychotic, actively attempting to harm herself many times. So there were warning signs along the way that Taylor Coronado was on a path to not ending up well, whether that meant hurting herself to the point of death or harming another person. And so again, we can understand that we need to destigmatize addiction and mental illness while both simultaneously holding that these things still do play a role in dark triad individuals. And I think that we all shy away from this conversation about mental illness and addiction because we think somehow that these things turn people evil, and that's not the case. An addiction is something incredibly powerful. A mental illness is an illness of the brain, which is an organ that helps us perceive the world and perceive ourselves. So, yeah, when the brain is sick, we are not attached to reality in the same way we would be if our brain was healthy. And even evil, twisted individuals sometimes need help for them to even understand why they do the things they do. So that's why a lot of us are interested in understanding forensic psychology and criminal behavior and psychopaths and dark triad, dark tetrad, dark pentagon, whatever the next step is. We're all here for it because we want to understand sinister deeds. We want to know what makes these people tick. And sometimes even they want to know what makes them tick too. So we're all on the same page. Let's understand what makes people do dark things, whether or not they are good, whether or not they are mediocre, or whether or not they are just pure satanical evil. So with that one last note, I will say that none of the medications or anything I talked about is medical advice. I'm only talking as somebody who has both spoken with many people with mental illness and as someone who also experiences mental illness myself. So, with that, I really appreciate you listening. My intent was to bring compassion and light to everybody involved in this case, including the evil, dark, sinister, bad people that we all want to rot in prison. Even them, they'll get a little dose of compassion because at the end of the day, understanding them means keeping our streets and our homes safer. Well, thanks for listening, guys. And if you like this, please comment, like, subscribe, whatever. I really appreciate it.